Joanna Macy, the great environmental activist and systems ecologist, said that when faced with planetary crisis, there are three stories we can tell ourselves. Business as usual, in which we tell ourselves that some degree of damage is necessary for human progress. The great unraveling, in which we tell ourselves that mass ecosystem destruction is inevitable. And the great turning, in which we tell ourselves that evolving the way we live is the only way forward, and that we're at the beginning of one of the great projects in human history. On this podcast, we talk to people who are writing that third story, with their own work and their own lives. Mission-driven leaders who are dedicated to social and environmental impact at this critical moment for our species. Welcome to The Turning Point. Today's episode is a sequel of sorts, Ian. A few weeks ago, we had Dr. Kinari Webb on the show talking about the groundbreaking work that she and her organization, Health and Harmony, have been doing to save critical rainforest habitat around the world. And if you haven't listened to that episode yet, my first recommendation would actually be to pause this one and go back and listen to that first. But the secret sauce of these partnerships Health and Harmony has been cultivating with rainforest communities is something that Kinari calls radical listening, which is now its own book. And we have Kinari and her co-author, Dr. Pat Plude, here to take us a bit deeper into this practice of radical listening and why it's so critical in this moment of these global cross-sector problems.
Yeah, this is a really enjoyable conversation. And it was interesting to think about the parallels. One of the things I find myself reflecting on is Health and Harmony, in partnership with these communities, are saving some of the most critical habitat on planet Earth. And this concept of radical listening may be the most critical part of the process to saving those rainforests. So I just thought that was an interesting parallel, and I'm really glad that they, took the time to write the book about it. So great conversation. I'm looking forward to the listeners getting to hear it.
Yeah, it is a critical piece. And part of the reason it pops out is that it's a break from the traditional Western way of thinking about problem solving. And it reveals what appears to be one of the primary obstacles to the kind of problem solving we need. And it's really hard not to learn about Dr. Webb's story and feel like, oh man, the entire way we approach problem solving in our culture may not be that well suited to solving the kinds of global scale problems that we're trying to solve. It's a real look in the mirror moment. And at the same time, it's like, thank God they wrote this book.
Yeah, if you're a listener who is concerned about prescriptive solutions coming out of the West and being pushed on the rest of the world, this is an episode for you. Because the way that they conduct radical listening sessions in order to do the work that they do is really, truly a bottom-up approach. The wisdom already exists within the communities connected to these forests. And this is simply a process to unearth that wisdom.
Yeah, and also a way for the rich world to connect with and support the people on the front lines who are close to the problems in a way that actually works. And it's almost like, gosh, why has it taken us this long to figure this out?
Yep, it's simple but not easy.
As are many of the great practices. So fortunately, Kinari and Pat are great teachers, and we have them here on the show. So let's let the lesson begin. Pat Plude and Kinari Webb, welcome to The Turning Point.
Thanks for having us. It's a delight to be back.
Yeah.
It's good to be here.
Wonderful to have you.
And a delight to have you back again, Kinari. So early in the book, Radical Listening, you contrast the philosophy underlying what you do with that of Market World. So I'm wondering if you could start by describing for us exactly what Market World is and how it thinks about planetary issues.
So if it's okay, Kinari, I'll start with this one. This was kind of my comparison in the book. I had just read the book by Anand Giridharadas about Market World, that had Market World in it. I'm trying to remember what exactly is the title of that book. Winners Take All. Yes, very catchy title. Winners take all. And he describes Market World pretty much of the ethos of the Western world, the Western capitalist world that we live in. And he documents it kind of by following people through some of the big consulting firms like McKinsey and talking about their experience there and, what it was like. And essentially, he says in Market World, it's kind of run by a powerful set of global elites who may or may not consciously or unconsciously be trying to change the world while also making sure that they're doing just fine or even doing better as they try to change the world for the better. There's kind of like this underlying philosophy that change should happen by the free market. This probably is familiar to anybody who lives in our world, rather than by reforming public systems, which has really gone out of vogue lately. It should be managed by those who benefit most from capitalism and should mostly not be opposed to their needs. And again, that could be conscious or it could be unconscious. It's just, it's a way of human beings running the world that keeps them where they are. He describes it as a culture and a state of mind, both. It's not just a set of practices. It has its own kind of think tanks and its own set of conferences and its own leaders. At one point, I was looking at this again yesterday, and he talks about often these consulting firms think of the world as kind of an engineering problem, that you can just move some dials and press some levers and things will, switch, and you'll toggle things off and on, and it'll just make it optimal. But that kind of way of thinking about the world doesn't register the voices of people who see a different world or who don't have access to that power. And it minimizes the concerns of people who are not served by the status quo. And again, that's not necessarily out of malice. It's just because there's a story that drives the behavior, if you will. And, when Kinari and I were talking, we both agreed that there's this worldview that basically says not only do the wealthiest get to run the world, but those with the most education get to run the world. Like, they're the ones who know best. And that's essentially that's the ethos of market world, I think.
And not just education, but formal Western education.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One could argue
Better
that is one very narrow way of knowing. But I want to just push a little further on this concept, because I think it's easy to listen to a characterization like market world and think, well, sure, the evil corporations do not have the best interests of everyone in mind. And I have not read this book, Winners Take All, but I suspect there's a little more nuance to it. I think he's also talking about people who consider themselves very climate change aware, very inequality aware, people who are thinking, how can we make the world a better place? But perhaps that they might be coming from an unconscious way of being or way of thinking that doesn't really fully recognize the way the whole world works.
Exactly. That's why I kept saying that it's not necessarily out of malice, and it really is this broader cultural view. And very, very, very good people work within that. We all work within that. None of us are exempt. Yeah, I kept thinking of, what is that story of the two little fish are swimming by, and the elderly fish swims by and says, "Water's great today." And then the two fish look at each other and go, "What's water?" Right? It's kind of like that. And I don't think any of us are exempt from market world, but I think some societies are, certainly ones that maybe I was listening to your podcast with Kinari, like the one in the Brazilian rainforest that just made first contact, 40 years ago, like maybe that community. But, where we live and what we're doing, we're all there. We're all there.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I ask in part because I feel like that's us too, right? We spend a lot of our time doing work in the American for-profit community, and a lot of our listeners, a lot of our clients are there. And so I think that's an important perspective shift. And the story for me from Kinari's book, Guardians of the Trees, that really brings that home, I think, very effectively, is about her early experience with the NGO in Indonesia. So we did cover that a little bit in her first interview, but Kinari, I'm wondering if you could just rehash that a little bit and get us started with how that experience sort of informed the roots of radical listening.
Yeah, and this is a really good example of how the worldview is the problem, right? And that you might have good motivation. But what happened for me was that at the point when I was thinking about returning to Indonesia and I was looking for jobs, I also wanted to work with one of the nonprofits out there. And that was right when the tsunami happened. Across the Indian Ocean. I was at the end of my residency. 200,000 people were killed. My residency gave me permission to go to do tsunami relief. And I got a position with one of the big NGOs. And we're all there, all these nonprofits from all over the world. And more money had been raised than had ever been raised for relief for any event that had happened. And these guys, it was so shocking to me. Every last one of them, they were not listening. They did not care. what the community said. And they were doing crazy things like buying an entire room full of malaria medication when there was no malaria in the region. So that experience really taught me that their philosophy was that they were the experts and it didn't matter what the community said. And when the communities, for example, said, thank you very much for the rice, but if we could please just clear our rice fields, then we can plant and we will have rice in 3 months. They're like, no, we don't clear rice fields, we give rice. I mean, they seem to almost even want dependency. So yeah, that's where, so I just decided I cannot participate in that system because it is too obviously completely wrong to me. And so I began this and I had already learned from studying orangutans that I didn't understand things. I would never have put together the fact that people were logging the rainforest to pay for healthcare. I only learned that from local communities. And honestly, it wouldn't have occurred to me going to Aceh that the first and most important thing was to clear the rice fields. I also would have thought housing, healthcare, no, rice fields. So it's essential that we begin to flip that narrative and understand, well, first of all, that we're all interconnected. And second, that the people who are closest to a challenge are the ones who understand how to solve it best. Not super educated people, and certainly not those who are benefiting from a capitalist system and producing the rice, which can then be given to people.
Yeah. So before we get into all of the ways that colonialism has upended people's dignity, let's just talk about this concept of interbeing, which you alluded to briefly. To me, and this could just be my reading of the book, but to me, this is the antithesis of the market world perspective that you describe. So, and to me, the foundation of radical listening. So would one of you be helpful and tell us your perspective on what interbeing is?
Yeah, I can start again, Kinari, and you can dive in. This concept the word was coined by Thich Nhat Hanh, right? But it is not a new concept. It is an indigenous way of relating to the world. It is an indigenous way of being. And I would say that it is, even though the word may sound a little quaint or even, I dare say, woo-woo to some people, it's really just reality. It is reality. My colleague, Sherry Hostetler, and her colleague, Sarah Augustine is a Tewa indigenous person, wrote a book called So That We and Our Children May Live. And the whole first part of the book is just saying, this is reality. We have built a story and a structure that is not reality, that in fact is a system of death. But the fact of the matter is that our world is interconnected. Humans are not the center. We are a part of it. We are one of the nodes. The entire world has to live, creation has to live in some kind of a flexible balance. And though that balance is dictated by some pretty clear rules of life, that if we push too far, if we break those rules or bend them too far, it's all like the web tears, right? It's a web of mutual dependence. The earth is in and of itself a closed system, meaning that we can't bring in more soil, we can't bring in more air, we can't bring in more water. I was thinking about this a lot. I watched a lot of the Artemis 2 videos that have been just sort of out these days, and just the beauty with which those astronauts showed us how they felt that. I think astronauts always do. There was something about this group that was just, as I told Kinari, they were just so deeply in love with each other and in love with life and in love with the earth, and everything they talk about that comes out. And so they just show us that we are this closed system. So market world is another story that we have put on top of that says somehow that we can extract things, that things are commodities, that the world is there to serve us, that we are, and if you go all the way back to the Bible, it's, that humans have dominion over the earth, right? That story, even though that's not the only creation story in the Bible, and that's not one that I particularly care for, but that is the one that we seem to have latched onto with a lot of our structures of how we live. So yes, inner being is reality, and that is the antithesis of this story that we have put on it, that Anand Giridharadas calls market world.
And if COVID didn't teach us that, and this war that is currently happening, right, we are all interconnected. You cannot hurt people or damage things on the other side of the planet and not expect it to have implications here, right? We're all
Yeah, I keep wondering when we're going to learn it. Like, what does it take for us to really learn it,
Go ahead, Ian.
Well, this is actually one of the questions that popped up to me as I was moving through the book. We had a conversation with the executive director of the Steger Center, which is an organization here in Minnesota, just yesterday. And one of their tenets is quiet mind. And as I was moving through the book and thinking about the concept of radical listening, which we're, about to transition into, one of the things that occurred to me was the importance of being able to have a quiet mind as you move through the process. I think it was somewhere in the middle of the book, there's a table of like, here are all the things that radical listening is not. Mm-hmm. And as I was moving through that list, I thought, yep, I've done every single one of these at some point in time or another.
Haven't we all?
And right. And so I'm curious, this kind of rhetorical question, which I'd like to make non-rhetorical. What does it take? Is there a certain amount of like inner work that has to happen in order for an individual to be able to show up and kind of be with the process of radical listening in a really intimate way? Because it feels like it's built entirely on this understanding or this premise of, interdependence, interbeing, interrelationship. And can someone even actually really practical radical listening without that foundational understanding or knowledge?
I'm going to jump in here, Pat. So I would say yes, because the process itself changes you. So I'll give an example. So one of our staff members, she first started doing radical listening, but she came from a background where I think it was harder for her to understand the concept. But she understood. She was working for an organization that now did this, and okay, she was going to do it. She loves to say, you really only believe in radical listening when you do it and you see that it works. And then you begin to really, truly understand like the wisdom of a group. And I would also say it's a practice, which is to say you get better with it over time. But when you begin to see that wisdom emerge over and over again, and then you see that the implementation of those solutions has dramatic whole system change effects. That, it can be hard to believe. I myself didn't even really believe in it beforehand, right? And yet the more you go through it, the more you begin to trust and really understand that interconnection. So I would say it's like a yes and. So, yeah.
I just want to add in here that sort of to relate it back to, Justin, one of your first question around market world and the nuances of market world, right? When I was thinking about this, I compared the process of learning how to live in interbeing enough to be able to do radical listening well, right? As for people like me, I'll speak for myself, to be kind of like a process of recovery. And I have some experience with recovery in my family, up close and personal, like lived it, saw what it took. And, the first step, in my mind, and I'm sure, people in recovery might say this differently, but the first part is just to simply see, to really see, to recognize, whoa, I need to recover. So like, how am I living in market world? How does it show up in my workplace? How does it show up in my communities? How am I sustaining it by the way that I'm living and the choices that I'm making, right? So that's the first thing, is just open your eyes and have the veil fall away and be able to see. And then I think the next piece, and I was thinking about this in response earlier as well, is that we have to have a sense of grace and self-compassion. We all live in that world, and we all help sustain it, and we all make choices that help sustain it. And if we just look at it and say we're bad and start to feel guilt and shame, we're completely paralyzed and we do nothing, right? So there has to be this real sense of, I see it, I'm in it, and I'm going to have self-compassion, and then I'm not going to blame them, not going to blame me, and I'm just going to take the first steps. And little by little, if you have grace and self-compassion, then you're able to kind of open your heart to a new way of seeing the world, of stepping out of that story and seeing a new way that allows you to make different choices, and hopefully choices that will begin to change things around you, knowing that you have to keep coming back to, we all live in it. And until some really big things change, we're all going to be there. Does that make sense?
Yep. Well, as you say, it's the water. Yes.
Yeah.
And sometimes it takes, I have a business partner named Ian. He likes to say sometimes you get to a point where the pain of staying the same is worse than the pain of change.
There's a phrase in the recovery community, change happens when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change itself.
Yep.
And as someone who's also in recovery, I think there's That was just something that stood out to me about the book and the process is like it requires the ability to get quiet and then lean into that space of vulnerability, for lack of a better term.
And I don't want to minimize the fact that there has to be self-compassion, because I know I have a fair number of friends and people that I know who can see that clearly, but then they just get stopped because they're so eaten up with shame. It's just not helpful.
Yeah, that's part of the water, I would say.
Yeah. Indeed.
The shame. And so let's get into how radical listening actually does create that experience. But before I do that, I want to kind of ground this first part of the conversation. I'm going to do your favorite thing, guys. I'm going to read directly from your book. So I think the 3 beliefs are a good grounding. So we've been talking a lot about this inner being concept, and I just want to ground them in these 3 statements. Belief number 1, humans everywhere would not only like to thrive in the present, but also yearn for conditions that allow their family, community, ecosystems, and the planet to thrive far into the future. Right? So to me, that's a statement about the dignity of all human beings and putting everybody on level footing, right? Second belief, the human and natural world are deeply interdependent, and our planetary health depends on honoring this reality. Again, like you said, a reality which is not always super present when one grows up in market world. And the third belief, those who are closest to the challenge and the pain are best equipped to determine the solutions to their own problems and to implement those solutions. Mm-hmm. Right? And I find those to be 3 very powerful mindset shifts. And saying them out loud, I think, has an opportunity to make you realize, oh, I may not be living that way, or I may not be operating or thinking that way. So I just want to put those out there, and then I want to talk about radical listening. So let's get into how that actually works to manifest those principles. So first question is, what are the use cases for radical listening? You guys, we've talked a little bit about where it applies and where it doesn't. So let's get really concrete about that.
So first of all, I would say for us, the use case has been rainforest communities know the best solutions for protecting the forests and for thriving themselves, right? So that, but I would say as well, I really don't want us to think about it just in that context, because that's a very specific context. We know many different nonprofits who've used it in all different kinds of concepts around the world. But also, Pat's been using it here in San Francisco, and we have certainly used it also internally as an organization. And I have business partner friends who've used it within their organizations and revealing kind of the collective wisdom of their staff, right? So that's another way of looking at it. You can also, I have not done it this way yet, but I also think about like starting a business, like thinking about what the solutions are that a given community is facing and how could you start a business that would exactly address those challenges, as opposed to trying to think yourself what are the solutions, instead asking what the solutions are.
Yeah, I think when I was thinking about how I would answer this question, I wanted to say, who needs a use case? Just do it everywhere, anywhere. Sorry. I mean, the skills of listening, I mean, I often quip that human beings have a design flaw in that we don't really know how to listen very well. It takes us our entire lifetime to figure out how to do it. And even then, we're not very good, right? So anything that can give us some skills of how to listen to our children, to our partners, to our loved ones, to our families, like any of that is super helpful. And then anytime you're in a group, to remember that this group is simultaneously a collection of individuals, each with really good ideas, and it is also a whole. And when you give the group a chance to wrestle and work with things, some greater wisdom that is going to emerge that's greater than the sum of the parts, if you will. And I could tell a story. Would now be a good time to do that?
Let it fly, Pat.
So I work with an organization here in San Francisco called Faith in Action Bay Area. It's a consortium of faith communities and schools and a variety of other communities. And their primary mission is to develop leaders, not necessarily to do service. They're not a service organization, but to develop leaders from among the most vulnerable communities in San Francisco so that we can build power and shift the larger systems at play that keep poor people not living well in our town of billionaires and tech execs and, all of that. A city that claims very much to be very progressive and a sanctuary city often does not live up to those values. So they have a model. Faith in Action has a model. Always. They do not call it radical listening. I did not teach it to them. This is their model of listening to the people who are most vulnerable. In our case, with how the organizing has unfolded, that is mostly Spanish-speaking immigrants, newcomers to the city, and we follow their lead. And I'm in a group of English-speaking people who are like the next several rings out. We're not closest to that vulnerability, to that injustice. And yet our job is to organize the communities behind us so that we can have a large group coming together to support that center nucleus. So I was in a meeting with them. This was just about 2 weeks ago. And the goal of the meeting was for what we call ourselves bridge builders, the English-speaking team, to kind of revitalize our relationship with the Spanish-speaking leaders. And we realized that we had become sort of distant. And there were a lot of reasons for that. The world is changing so fast, and we're just, trying to juggle with what's coming at us and do what we need to do. But we really wanted to get in a situation where we could kind of revitalize that. And so I was sort of one of several, but I was the one kind of running the English-speaking part of the meeting. And I essentially just asked a radical listening question. I basically said, what do you all need from us, the less vulnerable leaders of Faith in Action? What support do you need from us so that you can thrive even as you are doing this hard work of organizing for a long-term future for yourselves and for the city and for change and a more equitable, living arrangement and whatnot for all? And so the meeting unfolded. It was sort of like all the stories that I heard Kinari tell about, Madagascar and Brazil. And it was just, it's almost textbook. I was sitting there almost giggling to myself. So, for the first half hour, 40 minutes, we heard story after story of just how hard it's gotten. How hard the government is making it, the federal government, how hard it is to find work, how hard it is and expensive it is to get a work permit, the obstacles that you have to go through to access anything, how hard it is to live in the shelters, to not have money for food, like they can't cook in the shelters. If they get a day job and they miss dinner, they can't bring in any food and cook it for themselves. They're not allowed to have any food in the shelter at all. They risk getting kicked out if they do. And they don't have any money to go buy food, or a kid gets sick and they can't afford to buy Tylenol so they can, help their child. So it was heartbreaking. It was just story after story of how hard it was. And little by little, it started to shift, like, we just need a few basic funds. Can we just have a few basic funds? And can we have them so that we can have dignity to buy the food we want or to buy the Tylenol ourselves? Like, we don't want to have to go to a church pantry and pick it out. And so I saw that, I heard that, I saw it in their bodies, I reflected that to them, and suddenly the mood just lightened. It was just like, yes, that's exactly right. We just need some basic fun. And then someone said, what we need is guaranteed basic income. And the room just exploded. It was like, oh my gosh, that's what we need. And of course they know what GBI is. They know what guaranteed basic income is. They know it would really help them. And before long, we had hatched a plan to take the steps that we need, the organizing steps, to create hopefully what will become a little pilot GBI program within our organization. Then we'll use our organizing to see if we'll work with other vulnerable communities, hopefully move them into a place of maybe doing their own pilots. And with the long-term vision of using that to then pressure the city and say, look, we can do this. Can you do this? This is what we need. We need laws passed that offer GBI to live in this city. And the whole thing took about an hour, as Kinari always says. And it went through this beautiful process of the pain of the stories to a solution emerging, to this explosion of enthusiasm, to very concrete plans around, okay, what are the steps? And of course, we can't see all of the steps, but we can see far enough to organize that far. So it was just this beautiful example. And I didn't call that radical listening, and I didn't say, I'm going to do a radical listening meeting with you. I just asked a question that was in that spirit and then listened.
Yeah, there's something you said earlier about how all of us could use training. It's just like a basic human trait, right? But I do wonder if it's actually just endemic to our culture. And listening, like you said, because you were bringing us some historical context earlier, maybe it's something that we are able to do and we have systematically forgotten how to do it.
That's actually I like that idea. That makes me feel better about the design flaw, actually.
Yeah. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. We don't have to address that today. But I love that story, and thank you for bringing the concept of humane listening, or whatever we want to call it, to life. So maybe now is a good time to, if you could maybe pick that apart a little bit, or with another example, show us like the concrete steps if you are going in intentionally trying to conduct radical listening.
Well, it depends a little bit on which context you're doing it in. So we did this process in Indonesia, Madagascar, Brazil. We did it in a lot of different contexts, and I didn't really know how to teach it. So Pat really is the one who, with her experience in education, really was able to break it down into various pieces and help that process be taught. So basically, the way that we do this is we gather a group of people. Initially, I was very worried about who are the members of this group and how to choose them. But over time, I've discovered that if you are working with people who are closest to a challenge, it almost doesn't matter who's in the meeting. That sounds crazy, but that's really our experience, that a random group of people here, random group of people here, random group of people here, given enough time to work through a challenge, will often come to the exact same conclusion about what the solutions are. And again, that's what these...
Can I just add like one clarification there? Because you said something that I think could easily go unnoticed. You said, as long as it's the people who are closest to the challenge.
Yes.
Then it doesn't matter who shows up. But that's a very big caveat in a lot of community listening interventions that I've witnessed.
Yes.
I just want to say that. And then, pardon the interruption, please continue.
And I would also say that, like, in a lot of the communities where we work, it's also important to have the leader there. It's important to have the leaders because if they're not there, they didn't hear the solutions that the community comes to. And that can be problematic. And sometimes they have very good ideas too. You know, they're usually the leader for a reason. So it can be really helpful to have them. But otherwise, you just sit in a circle to kind of even the playing field, and you pose a question. The question we often like to frame in terms of reciprocity, which is to say full dignity for everyone, and that the solutions that this community comes to are ones that should be implemented. That's the goal of radical listening. You actually implement the solutions. And that if the community was able to implement those solutions themselves, they would have already done so. So there's some outside resources may be needed in gratitude for what this community is already giving, right? So understanding that interconnection and framing it in a positive light, and then just kind of being quiet and listening. Occasionally, you might want to, nudge the group in one way or another. Or as Pat was giving that example, you might want to reflect back. When I say nudge the group, occasionally, I find that people get too lost in the pain, and you might have to ask, what are the solutions? But that's like a very slight, it's not like you're saying, I'm telling you what the solutions are, but just, are there solutions here? Oh, we usually have an insider and an outside listener. So an insider is someone who also fully gets the closest to the pain, and an outsider would be someone who doesn't, and that can help the group actually frame it for the outsider, and that actually can help them understand it themselves. Yeah, Pat, what else would you add?
Yeah, so I just put like 5 steps that are super simple to remember, I think. One is pose a question that's genuinely curious, open-ended, and based in reciprocity. So Kinari just gave, a very beautiful answer around what that is. Then you listen. And the way I would say it is you listen with all of your senses. What I talk about in the book is being a good receiver. So it's not just the words, it's what body language am I giving off? What body language are they giving off? Like, right, be a receiver on every level. Then reflect when it's appropriate. Again, with your full body, not just with your words, but you can reflect the pain that you've heard. You can reflect the excitement that you hear and the solution, whatever. Test for accuracy. Did I hear that correctly? Is that right? Is that what you said? And then make a plan. And make a plan. I have this thing. My colleague always says, we go as far as we can see, and when we get there, we can see further. So you make a plan for as far as you can see. And then when you get there, you do more radical listening, and you make a plan for the next steps. And then you just, that process cycles. And then you ask another question and you start the whole process over again.
Okay, well, you guys make this sound very elementary, and yet...
It isn't rocket science, it's true.
Okay.
Everyone can learn it. That's the thing. Everyone can
Yes.
learn it.
Okay, and yet, speaking as a deeply enculturated Westerner, this is something that took me, I'm still learning to this day, and it's taken me years to develop some of these skills that you're naming, like being present and being able to listen and pay attention to body language. I feel like I've had to learn every one of these through practice and with good teachers like yourselves.
Well, isn't there a saying that says you teach what you need to learn? So, of course, right? Fessing up here.
Yeah, I can own that one myself. So, and you guys, and honestly, you're making it sound very elementary, but the book is very, very practically put together and has all sorts of practical skill practices and lessons. So, could you pick out maybe one or two lessons that people that you've worked with have found really helpful in developing some of these underlying skills?
But I just want to say too that it's a practice. You use that word, but that I just want to emphasize that. It is a practice, which is to say, like, meditation is easy. You just pay attention to your breath. But it's actually a practice, and it's kind of hard. It's very hard, actually.
Yeah, I differentiate between simple and easy myself.
Yeah.
Right.
Well said.
Right. So this is, and I'm still learning. Right? It is one of these things where we will probably learn our whole lives, and it's doable. And the only way you get better is through practice.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I kind of want to take this opportunity to say we want to teach this more. We've only had, since the book came out a year ago, we've only had a handful of opportunities to do so. So to say that there are certain things that we've noticed and trends we've noticed of what people find really valuable, give us the opportunity to teach more. That's what we want, so that we can notice that. We do always go through this question ourselves, what would be the most, we have an hour and a half. We just did this at Bioneers. We had an hour and 15 minutes. What were the most important things to teach? We ended up doing a very deeply beautiful Joanna Macy exercise in interbeing to try to, get people into that space. It was on Saturday afternoon at Bioneers, and I said, Joanna Macy suggests lying down when you do this, and boom, everybody was on the floor. It was and we put the lights down and had a 10-minute, meditation to get into that space. And then we kind of combined the skills of presence and rapport. So inner being is the first skill. Then we talk about being present yourself and then developing rapport. And the reason we chose those is because I feel, and I think Kinari would agree, that it's super important to teach, especially Westerners, that listening is more than just listening to the words, that it really is about reading body language and creating a sense of emotional safety through body language and connection in the room. There's this beautiful phrase that I learned through neurolinguistic programming, NLP Marin here in the Bay Area, that I use all the time. And they suggest that our critter brains, our most primitive brains, are always asking the question, am I with like kind? And do I like the kind I'm with? Am I with like kind? And do I like the kind I'm with? And if we can't answer yes to both those questions, at some level, we don't relax, right? This was part of the thing about our Bridge Builders team in Faith in Action wanting to create a deeper connection, because we'd realized we'd gotten distant and there was no longer that sort of physical rapport. We needed to be in the same place, listening and hearing their stories again and creating that sense of safety. So that's a super important skill, I think, to learn, this sense of full body rapport. And then we usually cut to the words, but we go specifically to keywords, the notion of keywords, which again is not something that we tend to think about, but is super, super useful when you're listening to someone, is to be able to find the words that they've used more than once, right, that are important to them, that clearly mean something to them because they've used them more than once, or they're words that have a particular emotional impact or that send the story in a new direction. I mean, I use this in my pastoring when I'm writing texts. I reflect words that people have sent me in a text because, in text, it's so easy to misconstrue and right? It's just so easy for the conversation to go off kilter. But if you actually reflect using the words that they used, you're on pretty good safe ground, and then the conversation takes off. So we usually teach that skill. That's kind of where we are now. One could argue that there might be other ones that we should teach, but again, give us the opportunity and we'll happily do that experiment.
And I would just also add that humans, in my education, I was taught very little about how to listen. Very, very little. Even as a physician, where listening is life or death, right? And the few things I was taught, I think are actually wrong. And those are, for example, not to use keywords, not to reflect back to someone exactly the words that they used, but rather to summarize it and use different words. And so those are, I just think it's interesting to me that I feel like my education system really failed me in this way.
I just want to add that I feel like part of the gift of this book to the genre of books about listening and how we listen is the fact that it carries all through those skills, but that ends up with how do you do all that with a group, right? Which is not something that I've seen really written anywhere. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but I've not come across it. Our listening tends to be more around how do I listen better to my partner so my marriage is better, or, that kind of thing. But this notion of how do you actually relate to the group as a whole, as an organism in and of itself? How do you track the ebbs and flows of the emotion? How do you track the key words that the group is picking up on with each other and repeating from each other? Like, how do you do all that? And that's kind of new territory, I think, and genius territory, in my opinion, with the way that Kinari used this work.
So please excuse me as I meander my way to this question, because it's not fully formulated. Another thing that I found myself reflecting on is we're talking about some of the underlying assumptions, right, before we even get to the process of radical listening. And as I was moving through the book, I found myself reflecting on times in my life where I feel like I've done a good job listening. And one of the words that I appreciate not only in Guardians of the Trees, but also in this book is that word reciprocity. And I was just kind of observing, there are times where I feel like I've done a good job listening, being very intentional, and then I don't feel the reciprocation. And then I have this kind of like self-awareness around being self-centered or self-absorbed, or like it just doesn't feel like an equal exchange. I'm wondering, as we're talking here about the skills needed to conduct this process effectively, could one or both of you speak to the element of you've been in the process, you've witnessed it firsthand, and you know what it's like to experience the reciprocity or the reward for conducting the session well, because then the group gets to move forward in a constructive manner. What about someone who hasn't been in that position or hasn't witnessed the success of a process like this facilitated well? How might they need to kind of deal with some of their own internal barriers that might present them from like fully partaking in the process?
So that's a tough one, Ian. So the first thing I think I want to say is that when we use reciprocity, there is a very, very deep reward. I mean, I came away from that Faith in Action meeting that I talked about just feeling so good, like just so happy, so warm, kind of warm fuzzies, right? Because I got to witness a process that was so life-giving to a group of people. And that in and of itself was just so deeply rewarding to me. When we use the word reciprocity in the book, it's really not so much about that interchange and me getting something as the listener out of it. It's more about how are we channeling reciprocity to the world, or from the world to the community. So in Kinari's case, it was, you are guardians of the rainforest. You are protecting something that you depend on and the planet depends on. All of us depend on. How can we channel resources so that you can thrive while you're doing this important work that we all depend on, right? That's the reciprocity piece. In the Faith in Action meeting, it's what could we as bridge builders do to support you while you are doing this really hard work of organizing that this city needs, right? That we're all coming behind to do with you, but you're taking the lead on, like you're doing the first lift, so to speak. That's the reciprocity piece of it. So then to answer your question, let me see if I can paraphrase the question, because I want to make sure I'm answering it correctly. So, or maybe even use keywords, who knows? How can someone who has not experienced that whoosh of goodwill, happiness, joy that comes from a process that has gone well, trust maybe, or understand that that process is there enough so that they want to enter into it? Is that the question? Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, yes, and what if someone is entering the process, with a like colonial Western perspective, and whether it's consciously or unconsciously, they're still hoping to get something out of it themselves?
Right. So I have witnessed this as well, and I'm sure, Kinari, you have as well. Maybe you can tell the story from your perspective. From my perspective, it's small. There's just the sense of people wanting to interject something into the conversation that they think is a really good idea. And you know how we all get that little hit when, "Ooh, I just gave a good idea to the group," and they liked it, right? And in my experience, what happens is, what I've seen happen is that idea will often fall flat because it's not the idea of the group. And so there's a moment of that sort of deflation, of that sense of like, oh. And I don't know that we can't protect people from that moment, right? We can't protect ourselves from that moment. Again, I would come back to the grace and the self-compassion and the sense of, oh, I just tried something. Look at that. That's not what this group wanted. That's okay. I can, take a deep breath and move on. I don't know that I have a better answer for it from that, other than we have to just keep practicing this sense of, it's okay, I get to make mistakes. It's okay, I swim in this water that I don't know is water. It's okay, I'm not a bad person. I mean well. I am doing well. I'm trying things.
So Ian, I think that's a really excellent question. And I'm honestly very uncertain about the answer. But I will say that in the workshops, Pat and I have done a whole bunch of workshops, and I've done a lot without her too. My experience is there's a lot of people who enter the process quite skeptical. And I get it, because I was skeptical myself, right? But even the short, an hour and a half or 3-hour workshop, or the exercises in the book are enough to open people's mind, like, wow, whoa, I'm experiencing something very different here. This is very interesting, and this could yield results, because also most people are very results oriented, right? In a way that will be fulfilling to me without it being about me.
Mm-hmm. One of our favorite workshop questions, and this is again, Kinari designed this, but we did this with pioneers, is just something, sit in a partner, face your partner, right? Sit with a partner and talk to your partner about a time when you really didn't feel heard. Like you just didn't feel heard. And you don't even have to tell the whole story, but just like, what did that feel like in your body? And then the person listening is not asking questions, not doing anything other than being present and saying, right? Just small ways of signaling that they're present. And then we say, what was that like? What was it like to listen in that way? But then what was it like to be heard in that way? And people are always just like, I felt seen. Like, I just felt seen. I felt understood. Like, so that's the glimpse that Kinari was just talking about. It's like they get this little glimpse of like, oh, this could be different. This could reveal something different. Does that get at your question?
Wording in a way, a much deeper level, not on an ego level, but on a connectedness level.
Yeah, I think the awareness that was surfacing for me was, you have to have an understanding that the act of service, the act of doing the radical listening, is for the individual the reciprocity. Like, that's what you get out of it, is being able to be of service. Is sometimes, I guess, and maybe this is me overlaying our own framework, but sometimes that's how I think about the work that we do, right? Mm-hmm. We spend a lot of time listening to teams and trying to find the solutions that are already within the institutional knowledge. And our job isn't necessarily to prescribe,
right.
But it's
you're already doing it.
For us, it's transactional, right? Because we are providing a service that's a paid service often, but there's something about the selflessness of the act of just listening, which is the gift back to self.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. My husband and I talk about it a lot because we both practice this a lot, like when you're just, the cocktail party scenario, right? Where you're having these little conversations and we come away from the cocktail party going, we listened to 15 different people and not one person asked us anything about us. Right? And there's this sense of like, and yet to those people, that was a huge gift because they got to be seen and heard.
Ian, do you feel radically listened to right now?
Justin, I appreciate your patience. As promised, Pat, I throw wrenches in the wheel, and then Justin cleans up.
It's a really good question.
And a very relevant one. Yeah, mm-hmm. I think that speaks to what a lot of people feel when they're trying to practice anything resembling radical listening.
Yeah, it speaks to the question of motivation. Why do we do this? Why would we do this? Why would we go to the trouble? And I like where you landed, Ian, that, there's just, sometimes we just do the right thing and know that we're giving a gift to the other person or to the community or to the world.
Yeah. And it feels good to do that.
Although I'm usually depleted after cocktail parties, I just have to say.
Right. No, and I'm actually glad that we're starting to pull this out of the weeds and into our everyday experiences of cocktail parties and marriages and so forth, because I think somewhere in the middle lies the world of work in which a lot of our listeners and guests operate every day. And so I'd love to hear you guys talk a little bit about some of those applications. Like if some of the leaders or founders who are listening to our show are hearing this, I would imagine this probably resonates with them on a lot of levels. So, but they're probably thinking, oh man, I don't know how I would begin to practice this within my organization. So what are some of the things they could take away from listening to what you two teach?
Well, one of the things that we do at Health and Harmony is that during our annual meeting, right, where all the staff gather together, and we have staff all over the world, so it's a big deal when they all get together, is we do a radical listening meeting and among the staff. And it's embarrassing, but there's almost always that something that comes out that is like so obvious that somehow as leadership we might have missed, And Anna promised to execute those things, right? And boy, they have made the organization a much better organization. And it takes humility. It takes some, trust, like kind of a faith in the universe to do that. And it's important to emphasize that we're not looking at we're not going to execute everything that every single individual says. We're going to execute the solutions that everyone comes to that they think are important, right? Like those kind of resonance ideas, because otherwise individuals might say, but I said, that's not what radical listening is. It's not every individual. And that can be important in community meetings too, to just make it clear that this is about the collective wisdom. But boy, it's powerful. Organizations, it can really improve an organization. It's not that much time. It seems like it's a huge, scary thing, but it doesn't take that long. It works. And then you've got some excellent things to execute on.
Yeah. Can I follow up on that real quick, Kinari?
Yeah.
You glossed over this idea of individual ideas versus something resembling group consensus like it was no big deal. I can assure you that is not an easy process. So how do you determine what is collective wisdom or group consensus? How is that reached? What does it look like? I think everybody would like to know that.
Yeah. So a lot of it, I would say, is these, and practice really helps, right? So my experience is that when I'm teaching this and we do it a few times, people really begin to get it, right? So it's these moments where the whole body language of the group changes. Sometimes everyone leans in. Sometimes there's yes. Sometimes people are just quiet and they all just lie back in just like a sense of yes. Those are those moments so people can go quiet, and they often do go quiet after those key solutions arise, because there's not much more to say. And even sometimes you'll see people okay, now we got that. Let's, what are we doing next kind of thing. So, and you want to check that you got it right? So you're going to reflect back to the group. These are the key things I heard. And it's often not one, but I would say it's not more than 3 usually. That's kind of the most I think that a group can really come to. And they're often intertwined, those 3 things. They go together in some way. And then, did I hear correctly? And I would not say that it is that every single person 100% agrees. We're not looking for unanimity. But that no one feels strongly enough opposed to it that they're going to say, no, absolutely not. And sometimes, when you're listening in a group, there might be, you can sense there's an issue over here in this side of the room or with those people, and you might say, is there anything you guys want to share? Or they want, so that can definitely be part of it, just to make sure to get into the room if there are some, disagreements. There's an interesting example from Madagascar in this, sort of an observer who spoke Malagasy was standing on the outskirts of the meeting that we were having. The village, and it was a real challenge that the community was really wrestling with about how to solve this one problem. And for a while in the group, it felt like there's no way we can solve this problem. And people were saying that we just need to be able to cut down the entire forest. There's no way. What are we going to do? There's just there's nowhere else to grow food. And then the village chief, the village king, they call them there, said, wait a minute, what if we had like an irrigation system over in this valley right here? And then suddenly the entire group erupted in like, like just like normally they had waited for one person to talk. Now it's just like, everyone was talking. And then they all just like, boom, they were quiet and they were like, yes, if we had that, it would be amazing. And this observer was standing in the back and there was one guy and he's kind of like, and she asked him, well, do you not agree with that solution? And he said, well, I just don't think it'll work. And she said, well, do you want to say something? And he said, no, because if it does work, I sure will be happy. And it did work, right? We actually executed that solution and it did work. And so that's an example of like, you might not get everyone 100% to agree, but boy, they can also say if the solution did work, it would be nice.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Pat, did you want to add?
I wanted to, sort of take it back to your question about how people might use it. And I want to sort of bring it back home to this notion of the water we swim in, that we're today calling Market World. It could be named any number of different things. And that so many of our organizations are set up in a very hierarchical fashion. There's a CEO who might be responsible to a board of directors, right? And is responsible for however well the project goes or doesn't, like the buck stops with them. And that's the setup, right? And that's not the same as going into a rainforest community and saying we have some access to resources that we can, right? It's just not the same. And so I think the first thing, again, is to do an honest just seeing of how is your organization set up. But then don't let that stop you. Right? From the point of, we don't necessarily have to go all the way to, we are absolutely going to implement these because we're going to bring in resources and we're going to do exactly, maybe in a workers' collective, that would work. But in most organizations, that's not how they're set up. But then the question can be, so what can change? What part of our culture can be different? Where can we foster a climate of listening, both from the top and then at every level of the organization? All managers be doing this with their teams? Can those managers be doing it with those managers? Can the CEO be doing it, with everybody at some point, even if it's just once a year, right? Like there are ways that it can be implemented. It just has to be done with this sense of like, okay, we're swimming in this water. And in this case, this is what it's going to look like.
Yeah, this is one thing that I would like to double click on for the listeners, because again, you guys are explicit in the book that this isn't a practice that's necessarily designed for, hierarchical organization.
The full practice is not.
And the thing that stands out to me in the work that we do with organizations that are generally hierarchical is that the way that I think about it is like expanding the definition of listening. I think most people in the West have a definition of listening, which is you said the thing, I sat with you while you said it, listening is done.
Right.
Yeah.
And in reality, as I understand the two of you describing the process, listening involves the follow-up and the follow-through, right? And so to Justin's point about double-clicking on the importance of determining what group consensus is, if I can take a moment and just double-click on the importance of the follow-through, we've seen it time and again where leadership will say, we want to do a listening process of some sort, a culture study, an audit, whatever.
Right.
And you do that, and then the follow-through doesn't happen.
Right.
And it's actually more detrimental than if you had never talked about it to begin with.
Yep.
And so we're at the point now with our work where unless there's like a very strong indicator and a commitment from leadership or whoever, the stakeholders that are bringing us in that we're going to do something about it, we're not even doing the listening sessions to begin with. Because you see this, you provide a platform for people to essentially like share the challenges and sometimes their traumas. And then if you just let it die on the vine, you've now compounded the problem.
Yeah.
And so I just want to emphasize that for anyone who's considering doing this or anyone who's, interested in the idea and wants to implement this, the follow through is part of the listening, and that can't go unmentioned or unnoticed.
Yes. Amen to that.
Yes, one of my favorite takeaways from our first interview, Kinari, was the radical part is you actually do what they suggest.
And again, that might not be possible to the letter of the law in some of these organizations, right, that are hierarchical, but there's still a lot, to Ian's point, there's still a lot of follow through that can be done. And I would also say that the way you listen too, that you've done more than just listen to their words, that you've actually listened to their body language as they tell their stories, and you've listened to the emotional pain and or the joy that certain kinds of work gives them and the stress that other kinds of work doesn't, or whatever it is, right? That you've listened in this whole body way and reflected that somehow.
And there's also, I would say, like a lot of these processes of listening within an organization are often surveys. And those, have their uses, but it's a very different thing to listen within a group and for people to get to hear what other people are saying. And one of the things that I find very interesting in a group as well is that sometimes someone else within the group will do the kind of facilitation, and then the leader doesn't have to do it. And that's much more powerful, which is to say, if someone within the group says, no, look, we're not going to do that, and that's not a good reason for this reason, right? That we don't think you should do that, or this is not really a problem, or whatever. If someone else within the team says that, or within the community says that, and not the listener, it's much more powerful.
I would also add, too, that in our culture, surveys can be a really good first step, especially for people who might not be willing or as comfortable speaking up in a group. So there can be a sense of leadership, quote unquote, figuring out, like, just hearing people on an individual level and maybe doing some one-on-ones, but then getting the whole group together so that then people who already feel heard through a survey and a conversation following a survey will be more likely to say, wow, this really bothers me when we do this. They might be more willing to say that in a group and then hear what the group has to say about it. So that's another way I speak from experience. My church is in the middle of such a process right now. Like, we started with a survey, but I'm very clear. It's like, we got to have a community meeting after this survey is done. After we've done the one-on-ones, we need to do some one-on-ones, and then we need to do a community meeting.
Yeah, thank you for more or less reading my mind there. A few steps back in the conversation, I had intended to ask, can this style of communication only be done in person in groups? And I think you're answering that question. That if it's helpful and necessary to collect certain data points at more remove, whether it's survey, whether it's one-on-ones, whether it's Zoom. But it sounds like you're saying there is something that can happen in person, in a group setting, in circle, that cannot happen any other way.
I would say that, but I would also say that I have done listening sessions on Zoom, and they work better than one would imagine. And during COVID, we actually did listening sessions with communities in Brazil via shortwave radio. Okay.
Wow.
Because it was essential to protect them from COVID, right? So
yeah, that story's in the book. It's quite something.
So I kind of would just add a little caveat that it's not like you can say, oh, it cannot happen if it's not in person. No. And I was surprised actually how remarkably well it worked. Now, shortwave radio is an unusual thing, which is that everyone can show up in a community and have everyone can hear everyone all at the same time, right?
When you were talking about body language and the importance of all the nonverbal signals, I thought, well, geez, I don't know how much of that you can accomplish on Zoom.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that we've made a practice, again, in my church community is, and it was largely me because of writing this book and learning this, it's like when I'm in a meeting, I tell people, please don't go on mute unless you have to for some compelling reason, like there's a dog barking or there's a child, that's needing attention or whatever. Because if I'm presenting something on Zoom and I get no feedback, it is so hard. I feel so alone, right? I want to be able to see you and I want to be able to hear you laugh if I make a silly joke or go, if I tell something stupid, or, you know what I mean? Like, I want that feedback because otherwise it feels disembodied. You're laughing, Ian, like you have some...
I'm just reflecting on, like, Justin and I have done many presentations via Zoom where there's 30 people in the call and 3 of them are actually showing their faces, and then 33 of them are not only no face but also mute. It's like there's just no feedback whatsoever. So I can resonate, but in some ways this brings me back. And Justin, feel free to correct the conversation because I know we're getting short on time. But to this point, it brings me back to one of the first questions that I asked around, like, the inner work required to do this process well. And Kinari, I think you used a word earlier about resonance. And can you read those cues in 2 dimensions, right, through a screen? And I think this is something, and Pat, you've spoken to it a number of times, around, like, full body listening, right? There's an ability to attune yourself to the listening process, even if you're not in circle, in person, but it requires a certain amount of self-awareness, right? It requires paying attention to your other sensory and non-sensory perceptions, because in our experience, having had this not only in organizational settings but elsewhere, when you find that resonance, the energy shifts in the room. Yeah. It's a frequency change, and it can be harder to read that two-dimensional via Zoom, but it's not that it's impossible to do. But I think those are, back to your language that some of you use around like keywords, that feels often like the underbelly of that is like, well, what's the resonance or what's the frequency that those messages are being delivered with? Because if that frequency keeps popping up, there's something to it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
See, and you are speaking as someone who has done this and who is a skilled practitioner. That's speaking to the way the energy changes in the room. It's real. It's palpable. It's like, I don't know what I'm saying when I'm saying energy, but I know it's there. I can feel it in the group, right? And that is what you're tapping into. That's right.
And that skill is actually the skill of presence that we talk about, which really has to do with what am I feeling in my body as they're all feeling what they're feeling in their bodies. Like, what's the communication that's happening body to body? It happened just a moment ago when I talked about the Zoom thing, and, I want to be able to hear, and I could see your body respond, Ian, right? And I knew there was something like, there's a story there, because I could feel it in my body. I saw it, but I also felt it, right? And then I prompted you, and you told your story about it, about what that's like for you, or you hinted at it at least. So it's very possible. Even in two dimensions, it's possible. Of course, it's better in person, but what isn't better in person in life?
And yet we move further and further away from that.
Yeah.
On a daily basis. Oh, the deep sighs I just caused. Sorry, everybody.
I
felt that one right here.
That was definitely a moment of resonance.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a positive one. My apologies. So we've spent a lot of time covering the obvious benefits of adopting any of these practices in your life, in your work, etc. What do you see as the biggest obstacles right now to adopting more of this in our Western context?
I think changing the story that we tell ourselves, or the story, actually I would say the story, capital S, within which we live, is hard. Changing our understanding of ourselves is hard, and our place within that story. And again, I bring it back to, I think that once we start to see, even though that's hard, once we start to see that story and see our place in it, it's hard not to be paralyzed by shame and guilt, right? Like, that takes a level of spiritual practice, spiritual discipline, to not go there and not let it sink us. Yeah.
But radical listening, I think, is like one of these key paradigm shifters, because when you do it, you get an experience of interconnection. You get an experience of a kind of a meta level of knowing. That in of itself breaks down the story.
Yes.
And so sometimes people ask me, what, how can we possibly change this country? There's just so much. I'm like, imagine radical listening sessions in communities all across the country, and that information actually feeding up to representatives. How powerful would that be if people truly felt listened to? And then how powerful would it be if leaders experienced that when community solutions are implemented, profound change happens? Like that, that's just it's one of those levers of change that I think is much, much, much bigger than it starts with yourself. It works within an organization or a group, and then it takes it to the next level, and it affects the next level, right? Because it is all interconnected, right? It's sometimes hard to remember that, but boy, when you see it and you feel it, especially when you feel it in a positive direction, right? It can be very disempowering when you're constantly feeling it in a negative direction. But to feel it in a positive direction is also incredibly empowering.
And it makes the case for just starting somewhere. Just learn a couple skills, practice them, notice what happens, try it again, notice what happens. When people start noticing that you're doing something different, teach them how to do it. right? Just start.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to regret asking this, but I just can't. It's coming up and I can't help it. I live in a city, Minneapolis, where city council members have relatively confined wards. They're small enough that those council members will often have listening sessions for the community and for voters, often on the campaign trail, but often at other times too. And those listening sessions are notoriously unproductive. And so I think some of the pushback you'll get from, say, politicians is, we do town halls, we do listening sessions. They turn into people yelling at each other. So what is your advice to those people?
Well, I would say there's a few things. You got to set up the meeting correctly. You put the politician up front on a dais, right? And you have all people in a row and they're all, of course it's going to go badly, right? And any expectation that we're actually going to be heard and actually anything is going to come out of this, in fact, a very strong expectation that we will not be heard, right? Of course they don't go well, but they could be set up differently and they would go well.
And I would dare say that when people get that angry, they just need to be heard in their anger. So maybe there's a series of 3 meetings that are set up in a row. And the first one, first of all, they come down off the dais, they sit among the people, and they just say, we're just going to listen. At some point, that community is going to get tired of just yelling at them because it's not going to accomplish anything and make anything different. They're going to feel somewhat better because they've been heard, hopefully, right? Right? You can have one meeting that's that, and then you say, okay, the next meeting you start with a reflection. And then I dare say it might not start in that angry place because that anger will have run its course. That anger gets pent up, right? And it is trying to say something. It has a message. It is valid. Is it productive to a solution? Not immediately, no, but I don't know. I don't know if that feels at all satisfying, Justin, but
I hear you. I think the other thing politicians, like I said, I might regret opening this Pandora's box. I think another thing politicians might need to hear is, how does this benefit me to do this, right? Let's say I take the risk and I hold this meeting and I sit in circle with people and not at the front of the room. And somebody's still going to show up with their cell phone, take a video, post it on the internet. And this is going to be a PR disaster for me because everybody's yelling and it looks like a disaster on this 90-second Instagram clip that somebody posted.
fair. I don't have an easy answer to, excuse me, the shit show that is our political world right now in this country.
Yeah.
I don't. We've gotten here for a reason, and it's going to take us a while to get ourselves out. I wish I had a magic wand, but
Yeah.
If I can just jump in and offer something to the listeners. I am generally not a person who enjoys books that prompt exercises as you move through the book because I feel typically that it becomes very self-evident how the writer processes life, and then that's the expectation on how you will process the book. But I understand that complimenting is not part of radical listening, but I want to compliment the two of you for the way that you wrote the book, because I think you did an excellent job providing like multimodal ways of processing as the reader moves through the book. And part of what that helped me see, or maybe feel is a better word, is that I think we, especially in the West, and to use this example of local politics, we're kind of conditioned for, let's do the broad strokes, let's just have the listening sessions, let's get it over with, and then let's move on. And what we end up with is change that's like a mile wide and an inch deep. And I think that if the listeners were to really take the time, if they're intrigued, like, go get the book, read the book, go get Guardians of Trees, read the book. And as you move through them, you will understand that this process is not only a way to create change that's a mile wide, but also a mile deep. And back to your point, Kinari, it's about the lived experience. And that process, it was just, the juxtaposition was interesting moving through the work of, this is a slow process, but creates real, durable, lasting change. And oftentimes I think in the West, we just want the Band-Aid solution that allows us to move to the next thing, which doesn't create lasting change. And so we just kind of like regurgitate or recycle all of the same challenges. Again, just a note for the listeners that if you're intrigued about this, I think this is really work to sink your teeth into, and these are the right people to kind of give you that exposure because of their lived experience in doing the work.
Well said, partner.
thank you for that.
Well said. And we have a tradition where we end the show and we give our guests an opportunity to speak directly to the audience. So the two questions are pretty straightforward. The first is, what is the highest leverage system level change that could make radical listening and its philosophy a more widespread practice?
Go ahead.
I would say two things. The lofty words are shift your consciousness, change your worldview, right? But the less lofty words are start and practice. Start, practice. Start again, practice some more. Like, it really is that simple. And it's kind of like what Ian just said, it's a slow process on one level. And at another level, it gets such immediate rewards and feedback, and you start to see changes immediately within small systems, in a relationship, in a family, in a community. And if enough of us are doing it, the world is going to change. It's just going to change. This consciousness will shift if we start and practice and start and practice.
It's funny because, we are in market world, we're very attuned to widgets to fix things, right? And we think a lot about just kind of shifting papers around, so to speak, or rules or whatever. But this is a much deeper level. It is a shifting of your perspective on the world. But those are the things that actually make the big difference in the world. They are the things that actually truly have ripple effects that are really big.
Yeah,
and this is small, but mighty and big.
Couldn't say that
I was going to
better.
say that, the things that start to change are not just this sort of notion of market world to inner being, like that might be the highest level, but like, can we challenge this notion that experts always know best, right? Can we just challenge that a little bit? Can we challenge our notion of power? I mean, I feel like that is starting, there's a lot of people are talking about power with or power over, right? But so can we start to think about how we relate to power? Can we get out of the zero-sum thinking that is just like, it's just like when we all do better, we're all going to do better. Can we get out of the short-term goals of next profit, next quarter, right? To a sort of a genuine openness. In a sense, there's this whole section in the book where I talk about the qualities of life that have kept life evolving for these many billions of years, right? And I mean, they're a little anthropomorphic, but they're there. It's like life just experiments. It plays, it improvises, it's curious. It's like, oh, that didn't work. So that doesn't survive so much, so I'll try something else, right? I come from a musical background of improvisation, and so I bring that in a lot into this work as well. It's like, let's play with it a little bit, because that's what life has done. That's what's gotten us here.
You tell us at the hour and a half mark that you have a musical background. Now we know.
Yes, my initial training was all in performance. I'm a pianist. But what's interesting about it is that I was thinking about this, that I never liked playing solo. Oh, I just hated playing solo. And of course I had to do it, like, to get those degrees. But I was much more of a chamber musician. And when you think about chamber music, because chamber music doesn't have a conductor, right? It doesn't have a leader. It's like everybody gets on stage together and you are reading body language. Like, my favorite was the piano trio, piano, violin, cello. And you're reading the language as, like when they're going to come in. And everyone's breathing together. And there's this sort of dance that's happening as people are playing. And I think that has stood me well in terms of being able to teach something about listening and listening to groups. It's sort of like this through line of my life that I find myself teaching it in this way now, when I was a professional musician and then taught listening and oral skills to musicians for many, many years. But I always did it with this improvisation and play and reading in groups. And yeah.
The parallels are many.
Yes.
That'll be another podcast. But we do live in an individual world. So the last question we ask people is, what is one thing individuals can do, maybe beyond reading your book, of course, to bring a little more radical listening in the world?
Well, start and practice. So just keep doing it. It does have big ripple effects. So yeah, buy the books. And also, we'll also just say we're available. If you have an organization that you want to practice this in, you want to give it a try, we're available to come help, or to come help virtually.
Yeah. My 5 points are: start, practice, notice what's changing, start to model it, and then when other people notice, teach it, right? And we would love to help you, as Kinari said. We'd love to help you learn how to teach it and do it, and just experience it.
Excellent. Well, yes, if you're listening and you have some decision-making power and a budget, we'll put their contact info in the show notes.
Great.
Pat Plude and Kinari Webb, thank you so much for coming on The Turning Point.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Big thanks to Pat and Kinari for being our guests today. To get a copy of their book and to learn more about incorporating radical listening into your work or organization, go to radicallistening.org. And if you're a mission-driven leader looking to grow your organization's impact, you can learn more about us at stillpointinsight.com. Big thanks to you for listening and for doing the work that you do.